Got it.
This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and I'm with Lisa Townsend, who is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey, and who is standing for re-election in the forthcoming PCC election on May the 2nd. Thank you for giving time for this interview, Lisa, and joining the Guildford Dragon. Right, first question then. Why do you think you would you would continue to be a good police and crime commissioner? You're standing for re-election.
I am standing for re-election, yeah. So I was elected, it was just 3 years ago, actually. Normally, so people understand, normally police and crime commissioner terms are 4 years. But because COVID put the last election back by a year and we stuck to the same timetable, it's just been 3 years, which isn't a very long time, particularly when you're new in role and when there's so much happening. But actually, I think we've managed to achieve an awful lot in the last 3 years, including bringing in over £10 million to support victims and residents in Surrey through sort of commissioning work. So that money is coming from outside of Surrey. It's coming mostly through the Home Office or the Ministry of Justice. I think that's really important. Also, really raising the profile within the force of residents. So we've just completed 22 meetings. The Chief Constable and I completed 22 meetings recently around the county. And the Chief has expressed to me, actually just a couple of days ago, how incredibly beneficial he found those, actually being able to meet with residents personally and hear their concerns, some of which reaffirmed what he already thought, but some of which were new to him as well. Also, I appointed a chief constable just over a year ago. Tim's just a year in role now, and I think he's making a massive difference. I think that's the single biggest change that we're seeing in Surrey Police, is that of a new chief constable who very much shares my goals for Surrey Police around ensuring that they focus on those things that only the police can do. So whether that's making sure that the force are responding to, properly responding to crime and not spending time on issues that other agencies should be fulfilling. We spent an awful lot of time working really, really closely on that as well. So yeah, a lot achieved, certainly a lot done, a lot more to do. And of course, it's great to see that we're now in a position where we have more police officers than we've ever had in Surrey. So keeping that work up.
Now, do you think there should be police and crime commissioners? Do you think it's a good way to structure the system, or do you think there is an argument that we should go back to the previous system, a committee at the county council, or do you think there's another better way?
If there's another better way, then nobody's managed to come up with it yet, certainly. I think that I'll be honest with you, Martin. When police and crime commissioners were first mooted, and this is going back a little while, police and crime commissioners and their creation was in Michael Howard's 2005 manifesto, for those who can remember back that far, and of course in David Cameron's 2010 Conservative manifesto. And then when David Cameron, along with Nick Clegg, formed the coalition government, that coalition government decided to bring in police and crime commissioners, and of course the current Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey was in that cabinet, and so a decision was taken to bring in police and crime commissioners. And I was a bit skeptical, but if I'm honest now, my skepticism was partly because I didn't really understand what police authorities did, and I didn't realise quite how opaque they were. With the benefit of having been in role now for 3 years, but also a lot of my team also worked for the police authority, so they followed all the way through, and they've seen, and so they sort of talk. They're very good at sort of explaining how things worked then versus how things work now, and it's completely different. I think one of the challenges with the police authority was they were largely unknown and unseen. Nobody could name who the chair of the police authority was. It was a councillor, obviously, who was elected as a councillor, so by their ward in Surrey, not to be on the police and crime panel. They were appointed to that separately through a political process, as were all the other members. Whereas now, as police and crime commissioner, if I'm to carry on, I have to get elected by the entire county. We have about 900,000 electors in Surrey.
But the turnouts are very low at those elections, aren't they?
The turnouts are low, yes, and I fear that this one will be quite low, particularly because in Surrey we have 5 districts and boroughs where there are no other elections, and that's part of the challenge, is getting out there and telling people it's happening.
Why is it then? Why is it that people aren't interested in who's appointed as the commissioner?
I think it's a lack of knowledge. I do think, I mean, that's why, you know, papers like your own, organised like the Guildford Dragon are so important. You've been really, really good, certainly throughout my time as PCC and before I was elected, at sort of talking about the role. And people don't necessarily talk about the role very much. And I try to get out there as much as I can, either with the Chief Constable or speaking to residents. I'm out every weekend. Most of my evenings are spent at residents' meetings across the county, talking to people about it. And I think when people do understand what the role is, and particularly when they understand that it's not just about sort of the policing element, and it's not just about firing a chief constable or raising council tax, but it's actually about representing victims across our county, making sure that we're bringing in money for those victim services, making sure that we're supporting young people, preventing crime, working very closely with the chief constable on the strategy, all of those things. When they understand what the role involves, then they become really interested and become quite animated about it, which is brilliant.
Okay, so now you've had your experience being in post. How much difference do you think a commissioner can actually make to a police force's performance? I mean, it's still the chief constable that has the operational control, isn't it?
And that's really important, actually. So Chief Constable retains operational control. So, for example, I can't say, can you please put an extra officer on the streets of Epsom or Ashvale or, Woking? That's entirely within the Chief Constable's remit. What I can do, and this was something that the old police authorities weren't able to do so well, is I can work very closely with the Chief Constable and saying, right, what resources do you need? Show me your plan, a costed plan, sort of like a business case, really. What resources do you need in order to fulfill the strategic objectives that I've set out, but also the plan that you've set out that comes underneath that? And it's those conversations that go, for example, when it comes to setting the council tax. So I always start with the Chief Constable with okay, let's pretend I'm not going to raise it at all. You're getting the same amount as last year. I'm not going to raise it. Now convince me, because for every pound that I'm asking Surrey residents for, you have got to convince me why they should pay that money, why they should give that money up to policing and not to something else. And that is, it's because of that money that we are able to be in the position we're in, where we're the fourth safest county in the country, the third safest for violent and knife crime, the safest county in the country for homicide, more police officers than ever before. Now nationally, the top force for answering 999 calls. That is because of the money that the Surrey public are putting into policing in Surrey, and of course the government. Can't forget that as well.
Okay, now you've mentioned some of the performance targets there, but if we compare the Peel reports for 2022 with the one that was published last December, actually the performance dipped between those two reports. In 2022, Surrey Police was graded outstanding in one performance area, good in 3, adequate in 4, and requires improvement in only 1. None were graded inadequate. In the latest report, no areas were marked as outstanding, 2 as good, 4 as adequate, 2 as requires improvement, and 1 now as inadequate. And that one is responding to the public. Now, I know you have said that has improved, but why did it ever dip down to that poor level?
Yeah. So one of the things I would say is that it's very difficult. And one of the things that I have learnt while being PCC is that you cannot compare HMIC reports with each other because of the way that they do the investigation. But that's, needless to say, that the problems that were raised at the end of last year, I think one of the things to say was that we weren't surprised by any of them. I know that there was a feeling among some in the force that our 2022 report was slightly over optimistic, and that our 2023 one was probably a little, perhaps a little, I know some in force felt it was a little unfair. However, the important thing is that, we work really closely with HMIC when they come in to show them everything. What I was pleased about was none of the issues that were raised by HMIC were things that came as a surprise to us, because that's it for me. When the Chief Constable and I sit down and talked about the draft report that we got, what I was looking for was reassurance from the Chief Constable that none of this was a surprise and he already had a plan in place to tackle it. And that was not as shiny and sexy and media friendly, of course, but that was recognised within the report as well. The particular area around responding to the public, which, as you said, was graded inadequate. Again, not a surprise and something we already had a plan in. So one of the issues that we faced, the main issue that we faced, was in our contact centre, which, as people will know, is based in Mount Brown at Guildford. And they're the people who answer the 999, 101 calls, or if you contact us digitally, however you get in touch with Surrey Police, that's where that comes to. So that's a group of very highly trained people who are, we call them call handlers. They're actually crisis managers. They speak to people when people are having their absolute worst day imaginable. And a lot of them had left the contact centre to become police officers when we went through our massive recruitment, same as PCSOs, who are also police staff. They left the posts to become police officers. It's one of the reasons we have so many officers, but of course the payoff was losing people within those roles. We then went through a very intense recruitment period, which, as anybody living in Surrey will know, is very, very difficult, because Surrey is an expensive county to live in. Guildford is a lovely, lovely place to work, but it is expensive. And of course, in policing and police staff roles, they're not paid as much as I would like to pay them. And I don't think they're paid what they deserve, quite frankly, given the job they do. But it did give us a challenge with recruiting. So we increased our recruiting. We increased how we did it. We improved the ways in which we actually reduced the number of hoops that people had to jump through in order to, get to that stage and get to interview and go through their training. And so we're now at a position where we've over recruited, and that's brilliant. And that's why we are now performing the best performing force in the country for that. And that's happened in a relatively short period of time. And it is down to...
Don't you think that begs the question, why did it ever get so bad?
I think that what the force didn't anticipate was how many of the contact centre staff wanted to become police officers. And that's why we've now put in, not just within the contact centre, but much wider across the force, conversations that happen with people on a much more regular basis about what are their plans for the future. Do they want to be police officers? Do they want to move into a different area of policing within Surrey?
Because for public satisfaction, we want to know that when we pick up the phone, if there's an emergency, or even if we've got information to give the police, that they're going to react quickly, don't we? I mean, it's
absolutely
really worrying if they don't.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why the force had got themselves into, I say they got themselves into that position. They were slightly a victim of their own success when it came to recruiting. The important thing is they've sort of been able to recognise it and deal with it, and we won't be back there, because they've managed to sort of put in place now a system where that can't happen again. Okay. But the force are the first to put their hands up and say, we got this wrong.
Right, but the satisfaction levels, I mean, there was a report that came in from the Police Federation yesterday that showed, according to them, 1 in 5 Surrey police officers are seeking another job.
Yeah.
Is it just down to pay or job satisfaction?
No, it's a really interesting one. I speak to officers very frequently. I go out and I'll spend a shift with them, talking to them, and they're very honest and open about it. And what's interesting is pay is not the thing actually that comes up terribly often. It does sometimes, I'll be honest, it does. And it's very frustrating. I wish we could pay them more. Again, we know that Surrey is a very expensive county to live in. A lot of our officers aren't able to live in Surrey. They commute in from Hampshire or Sussex.
It's your colleagues, it's your party colleagues, I should say, at central government that control pay levels.
That's right. Yeah. So
your party is responsible, isn't it?
Partly through, and wages have increased. I mean, policing had the largest increase in pay last September during the pay settlements. Police officers got the largest increase, because it's all looked at across the board. And the government do it based on what the independent pay review body recommend. And they implemented the recommendation from the independent review body. So, but the reality is, I don't think those working in the public sector, particularly in somewhere like Surrey, which is so expensive to live in, we are never going to be able to pay our public sector workers. And I include in that our paramedics, our nurses, our firefighters, and of course our police, and our teachers. We're never going to be able to pay them what they can earn in the private sector. And policing is the skills that are required to do it, and the skills that they learn on the job make them, quite frankly, incredibly attractive prospects for the private sector, whether that's in security or in another field. So, and I don't blame any officer who wants to earn more and, you know, earn more for their family, earn more for themselves, and I think that's important. However, the other side of it, so pay is one thing, but that's actually not the thing that comes up the most. What comes up the most is the amount of time they're spending dealing with non-crime issues. So when you think about it, over 80%, 80% of the calls that come into Surrey Police, into that contact centre, do not result in a crime report. So the police are often seen as the service of last resort. And the one thing that's come up time and time again, that comes up every time I speak to officers, is mental health, is the number of mental health cases that they are dealing with, that quite frankly, they shouldn't be dealing with. You know, an officer spending 18 hours sitting at St. Peter's Hospital, two officers, you know, with somebody who's experiencing a mental health crisis. Nobody thinks that's the best use of their time.
So what can you do about that?
Yeah, so 3 years ago, I took on the national brief for mental health specifically to work on this, because I'd done work on it previously in a sort of previous life on a policy side, and worked very closely with the government and with the forces around it. And a year ago, I signed, along with the Ministers for Health and Policing and the National Police Chiefs Council, something called the National Partnership Agreement, which brings in something called right care, right person. And that is designed to ensure that if you are experiencing a mental health crisis, you're dealt with by the right agency. But from a policing point of view, it's specifically to make sure that police officers can, it brings the handover period when police officer is required and brings somebody to a hospital to an hour. It also means we're not dealing with a lot of those cases. And 1 million hours a year are what the government have estimated that will save police officers, which is 1 million hours when instead they can be dealing with burglary, with antisocial behaviour, with shoplifting, with all of those crimes that we know people want them to deal with.
But I'm sure people in the National Health Service, though, would say that their services are already under stress, and you know that it's going to be difficult for them.
And they do, and they have. But the difference is the National Health Service received £2.3 billion post-COVID from the government specifically to deal with mental health. Okay. Quite rightly, the police don't receive any extra money to deal with mental health. So I think that's
really. You feel the resources have gone to the right area to try and help that situation.
I do think they've gone to the right area. But the other important thing, Martin, to remember is that police for years have been doing this, created a bit of a rod for our own backs in it. But when I have senior doctors say to me, well, Lisa, you know, we're all stretched, as you say, we are all stretched. And I'm very clear with them. The difference is I'm not walking into St. Peter's on a Friday night saying, can I borrow 2 nurses? No. Because there's been a burglary in Woking. And that's the difference. And so that is why, and I feel very strongly about this, but that's the kind of thing that we can do for police officers, which is to make sure that they are doing what they came into the police service to do, which is what only police can do.
Now, sort of linked to that is that there's a public perception, quite a wide perception, I would say, that the police are not visible enough. They're not often expressed as there's not enough bobbies on the beat. Do you share that concern? And if so, what can you do about it?
I understand the concern, because I think that although Surrey is an incredibly safe county and we're the safest in the southeast by quite some distance, perception is really, really important. And you know, we do have a very safe county, and so any crime at all, you know, it does stand out, particularly when we talk about antisocial behaviour, which is unfortunately still, I believe, underreported. So the bobby on the beat is something that is important. It matters to people. They want to feel safe. They don't want to just know they're safe. They want to feel safe. And for a lot of people, seeing a police officer on their street is part of that. I think one of the things that we have to remember, and I talk to residents about a lot, is that since, you know, Dixon of Dock Green sort of made his fictional name, policing has changed an awful lot in the last 5, 10, 20 years. So whereas police used to police exclusively in the public realm, so, you know, that was on streets, outside pubs, all of that kind of thing, it's changed an awful lot. Nearly half of all reported crime now in Surrey is online fraud. When you couple that with the rise in online paedophilia, those are elderly neighbours who are being targeted online and on the phone, and the rise in domestic abuse. And I'm thrilled that domestic abuse is that reporting of it is rising. That's really, really good. But of course, we have to do everything we can to deal with that. Now, all of that kind of policing, and they are our most vulnerable. We must remember they are our most vulnerable residents, are those who are, it's your 9-year-old daughter who's upstairs with her iPad, or it's your 90-year-old mother who is at home on her own, reliant on her phone and perhaps her computer. That is how people are targeting them. Domestic abuse, you've got the most manipulative criminals, domestic abusers, who are behind closed doors with the most vulnerable, and it might be a woman and her children. So policing, a police officer on the street isn't helping any of those people. Not at all.
So although it's is it right to summarize it, then you understand it, but actually times have changed and the biggest threats are no longer countered by a police officer?
Criminals have evolved, county lines, things like that. What we're doing is we're going after the people who are perpetrating the problem, and they don't leave their houses. They're not walking the streets stealing drugs. They've got 14, 15-year-olds doing that for them. So they're the people we're targeting. So criminals have evolved. We've got to make sure we evolve. That said, I do want to make sure that there is a police presence on our streets, because I do think it's really, really important that people see that and they feel it. But I have to be honest with our residents. There's no point. The easiest thing in the world, Martin, would be to say, yeah, you're absolutely right, let's just put all the police on the streets. I would be doing a massive disservice to the most vulnerable victims in Surrey if I did that.
Okay. Now, Surrey Police is the most reliant force on council tax in the country. Why is that? And is it a problem?
Yeah, yes. So the reason for it is slightly historic. It's going back to police authorities, actually, which you asked me about a little while ago. So one of the things to say about police authorities was that they were more expensive than PCC. So, for example, just as a basic, the police authority and what they were paid in addition to their council expenses. So just what they were paid in order to be on the police authority far exceeds what, for example, my deputy and I combined are paid. So that's the first thing. So they had to keep that up. So that's sort of the first point. But police authorities didn't have the same restrictions that I, as PCC, quite rightly have on raising council tax. And there were a couple of particular years in Surrey when the police authority existed, and one in particular where the police authority put council tax in Surrey up by 28% against a national average of 16%. And that was something that they did more than once, shall we say, in Surrey. And what that did was that meant that Surrey automatically overtook other counties and other force areas in terms of the proportion of council tax that we spent. That system all changed when police and crime commissioners came in, and we get set every year. We get told what the cap is in terms of how much we are expected by the Home Office and the Treasury to go out to raise council tax by, exactly the same as local authorities do. It's no different. They are also told how much they're expected to raise. So it's exactly the same for PCCs. So the police authority, having put that up significantly, when they had control of it, and of course didn't have the same representation. You couldn't just vote your chair of your police authority out of their role. That is the historic reason why Surrey's council tax is so high.
Okay. And finally, is there anything else you'd like to say that might persuade voters you are the best candidate?
Well, I think 3 years in the role has taught me an awful lot, and it's very, very easy when you're a candidate to make all kinds of promises about, we've just talked about it, more police officers, or we're doing certain things. And I think the important thing to remember is that we are here as a strategic oversight, but also to work very closely with the public and to be open and honest with the public about what we can and can't do. I'm enormously proud of the fact that the force is that we've got a brilliant new chief constable who I appointed a year ago, that we've got more officers than ever before, that we're performing nationally as the best county for answering our 999 calls, which I know really matters to the public, quite rightly, that we're safer than we've been in a very, very long time as a county, and still by some distance the safest in the southeast. And having brought in more money over the last 3 years than my predecessors in terms of money into the county for our victims, for our vulnerable people. And I'd like to be given another 4 years to do even more of that.
Lisa Townsend, thank you very much.
Pleasure.